en heren. Hartelijk welkom bij jullie speciale doctorale graadbeplechtigheid aan onze universiteit. We welcome you to the special doctoral graduation ceremony, and we trust that it will be an enjoyable experience for all our doctoral candidates, their families, and friends. Research is an important part of society. It is very important to all because it is a mechanism whereby science produces new knowledge, and knowledge is very important for development and for progress in society. En dit is de demonstraties op die prestaties van ons doctorale kandidaten, wat vanochtend hier al graag krijgt. Maar dan maak een groot bijdrage aan kennisproductie in die belangrijke velden zoals natuurwetenschappen, agriwetenschappen, economische en bestuurswetenschappen, als ook ingenieurswezen. I am proud to say that South Africa's National Research Data for 2013 has confirmed that Stellenbosch University still has the status as the research leader of South Africa and of this continent. And we have the status now for the 5th year in a row, and we will continue to maintain it as our vision is to maintain the momentum of our excellence in this country and in the world. And it is this level of excellence that allows us to also be a place of significance and relevance, and we aim to make an impact on society, and I have no doubt that today's recipients of doctoral degrees will do exactly that with their research. So you will see each and every one of them as they pass here as the builders of the future, one of the great nations of the world. So ek sal nou aan die kandidaten wat aan my voorgestel word, die onderskeie doktersgrade neem. I'll now confer on the candidates who are presented to me the respective doctoral degrees.
Meneer die vice-kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Angela Botus with Supervisor Professor A. Botha.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the leading cause of fungal meningitis among HIV patients in sub-Saharan Africa is Cryptococcus neoformans variety Grubii. Angela demonstrates that this environmental pathogen utilizes similar enzymes while growing on wood and bronchial mucosa, thereby providing critical insight into the initial colonization of the lungs by this clinically significant pathogen. I request you to confer the degree on Angela Botus.
Linda Botha met promotor Professor A.J. van Renen.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the development of particle morphology and chemical composition distribution during the commercial gas phase production of polypropylene impact copolymers is responsible for the physical properties of the products produced from these materials. This research probed for the first time the evolution of these parameters during commercial production and significantly advanced both fundamental understanding of the process and the control over the final product properties. I request you to confer the degree on Linda Botha.
Michiel Burger de Kok, with Supervisor Professor H.C. Eggers.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Bayesian analysis is of the view that physical reality is known to the scientist only indirectly in the form of information. Focusing on information, the candidate has re-derived conventional statistical physics, highlighted that it contains an unnecessarily restrictive assumption, and then generalized it to include new forms of energy, entropy, and measurement. I request that you award the degree to Michiel Burger de Kok.
Tanya Magdalene Haupt, Professor T.C. Wassler will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the candidate demonstrates that wandering albatrosses serve as ecosystem engineers for an important caterpillar species on subantarctic Marion Island. The work shows how subtle the interactions are between marine and terrestrial systems. Its outcomes have far-reaching implications for understanding the impacts of climate change and biological invasions on keystone species in the region. I request you confer the degree on Tanya Magdalene Haupt.
Denzel Eugene Joseph, Professor R.M. Engelbrecht will deliver the commendatio on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the prevalence of diabetes is a major health problem and requires further study. Mr. Joseph found that short-term glucose exposure triggers detrimental events that eventually limits glucose uptake by heart cells. Various therapies tested aimed at the pathways here identified could restore glucose uptake and offer promising potential for the management of type 2 diabetes. I hereby request you to confer the degree on Denzel Joseph.
Adrian Nyago and K. Louisa, with Supervisor Professor M. Rautenbach.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study of Adrienne Louisa highlighted the potential of tyrosides, antibiotic peptides from soil bacteria for anti-malarial drug development and for preventing foodborne listeriosis. The tyrosides were observed to have multiple targets, which limited the potential of resistance. This research will advance antibiotic peptide drug discovery and development. I request you to confer the doctoral degree to Adrienne Nyangu Nke Louisa.
Cristiano Joa Makuamule, with Supervisor Professor E. Strauss.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in this study the candidate investigated pantothenamides a class of analogues of vitamin B5 for their activity as inhibitors of the human malaria parasite's proliferation in blood, as well as the basis for the effects that were observed. In the process, a new inhibitor was discovered that shows potency comparable to that of chloroquine, a well-known anti-malarial. This compound's potential for development as a new anti-malarial will now be explored. I request you to confer the degree on Cristiano João Makuamule.
Kumu Gwendoline Maiko, with Supervisor Professor H. Pash.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, novel multidimensional fractionation methods for the analysis of complex polymers according to microstructure were developed. Comprehensive information on the correlation between molar mass and microstructure was obtained by two-dimensional chromatography and the coupling with nuclear magnetic resonance. This most advanced approach to microstructure analysis has been published by the candidate in top international journals. I request to confer the degree to Ms. Kumo Maiko.
Nametsu Precious Mongakwetsi, Professor A.J. van Renen, will deliver the commendation on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, green plants use chlorophyll to capture sunlight as an energy source for photosynthesis. As part of the development of a biomimetic light harvesting system, porphyrin nanorods were embedded in polymer matrices. The changes in characteristics of the porphyrins upon self-assembly into nanorods and upon embedding them into polymers were investigated. I request you confer the degree on Precious Mongoketsi.
Tendai Muswugwa, with Professor Supervisor Professor L. Dreyer.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this pioneering study provided insight into the diversity, ecology and evolution of ophthalmatoid fungi associated with Afro-montane forest trees. 18 ophthalmatoid species were discovered, 10 of which were new to science. Associations between ophthalmatoid fungi, mites, and subcortical beetles were also elucidated. These results have implications for both forestry and conservation. I request you to confer the degree on Tendai Musvugwa.
Gordon Sandile Ndimandi, Dr. J.R. Lloyd will deliver the commendation on behalf of the supervisor.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Sandila Ndimande has taken an animal-derived cellulose synthase encoding sequence and successfully expressed in transgenic sugarcane lines that he generated. The transgenic lines showed an increase in cellulose synthase activity, and consequently, those lines contain an elevated level of cellulose and, in addition, reduced levels of lignin in the cell wall. I request that you confer the degree on Sandila Ndimande.
Ethyl Emerentia Piri with Supervisor Professor S.R. Daniels.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the systematics and phylogenetic relationships amongst Afrotropical freshwater crabs were examined using mitochondrial and nuclear DNA markers. The results revealed the presence of 5 morphologically distinct lineages and 7 cryptic lineages. Phylogenetic results suggest several cladogenic events in East and Southern Africa that reflects complex zoobiogeographic patterning. I request you to confer the degree on Ethyl Emerentia Piri.
Adriami Haja Ramanantua with Supervisor Dr. C. Hoy.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the ability to predict the dynamics of range expansion is crucial for conservation planning, especially for controlling invasive species. In this regard, the doctoral candidate Andrea Mihatia Ramanantuan has successfully developed general formulae which depict the velocity of spread under a variety of scenarios. As a result, I request you to confer the degree on Ms. Andrea Mihatia Ramanantuan.
Christian Matthias Rover with Supervisor Professor K. Müller-Nederbok.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, new theoretical methods were developed to maintain the specific knotted state of a polymer chain, although the chain itself may change shape. Using topology-conserving rearrangements of the chains, polymer configurations could be constructed explicitly or alternatively allowed to develop using stochastic dynamics, opening up new strategies for calculating properties of such systems. I request you to confer the degree on Christian Matthias Rover.
Egmont Johan Rover with Supervisor Professor H. Schurer.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the dissertation deals with the initial, very fast microscopic processes resulting from light absorption in a modern organic solar cell. Egmont Rover's results, obtained with ultra-fast laser spectroscopy, help to improve the design of these solar cells for better light harvesting efficiency and durability. I request you to confer the degree on Egmont Johan Rover.
Adriana Roux met promotor Professor J.H. van Vuren.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Rihanna Roux has developed a theory for solving location problems involving multiple facilities over geographical networks, which includes the establishment of asymptotic bounds on the minimum number of facilities required to meet some level of service for various infinite classes of network topologies, as well as the design of various algorithms for determining this minimum number of facilities for a given network topology. I request that you confer the degree on Rihanna Roux.
Muhammad Ibrahim Samuddin, with Supervisor Dr. J. Lloyd.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Ibrahim Samuddin studied starch metabolism in 3 different plant species. He was able to manipulate them in order to alter the starch phosphate content. This will be a particular benefit to the potato starch industry that will lead to production of starches with novel properties. I request that you confer the degree on Mohammed Ibrahim Samuddin.
Belinda Louisa Swart, Dr. A van der Merwe sal die verklaring namens die promotor doen.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the multidisciplinary nature of this study of Belinda allowed for a much better understanding of the evolutionary processes within the marine fish genus Seriola, and specifically the commercially important yellowtail. Important guidelines and recommendations from this study can now be implemented and utilized globally as well as locally in the sustainable management of this economically important fish species. I request you to confer the degree on Belinda Swart.
Andrew John Swartz, with Supervisor Professor S.F. Mapoli.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, as part of his PhD, Andrew Swartz developed and characterized a series of novel catalysts based on new nitrogen and phosphorus chelates for the oligomerization and polymerization of ethylene. Using both experimental as well as computational techniques, significant insight could be obtained into the kinetic behavior of these catalysts. This will lead to more rational design of such catalysts in the future. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you refer the PhD degree on Andrew John Swartz.
Jacobus Andreas Swartz, with Supervisor Professor P. Papkar.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, an experimental search for the 5-alpha oil-like state in neon 20 was conducted with the neon 22 PET reaction at 66 MeV. 6 new states were discovered, 3 of which may be isobaric analog states of oxygen 20. A candidate for the 5-alpha state was identified above the 5-alpha breakup threshold energy. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Jacobus Swartz.
Ansha Marie Trotsky, met promotor Professor M. Rautenbach.
The Vice-Rector, Vice-Chancellor, sorry. The study of Ansha Trotsky highlighted the potential of the tyrosidines, antibiotic peptides from soil bacteria, as potential drug and biocide lead compounds. The tyrosidines have potent antifungal activity against a range of plant fungi, and as well as Candida albicans, a human pathogen. As they have multiple targets, resistance is limited and potential unlimited. I request you confer the doctoral degree on Ansha Marie Trotsky.
Jacobus Albertus Koch-Visser met promotor Professor A. Louw.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, extracts of Cyclopia used to prepare honeybush tea were found to beneficially modulate molecular targets involved in breast cancer, such as estrogen receptor subtypes, without eliciting associated negative side effects such as uterine hyperplasia. These findings suggest that Cyclopia extracts may potentially be developed as a natural supplement to treat or prevent breast cancer. I request you to confer the degree on Koch-Visser.
Meneer de visiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan die kandidate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefstuk doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confirm the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Mariette Rieksbrand, Dr. R. Veldman sal die verklaring namens die promotor doen.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this study focused on the importance of insect pollination for the South African hybrid onion seed industry. The honeybee was the most important pollinator, whether from managed hives or from natural habitat. Both wild and managed honeybees are essential and critical step for hybrid onion seeds on a sustainable basis. I request you confer the degree to Mariette Brandt.
Richard Damien Hunter Bugan, with Supervisor Dr. Willem de Klerk.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, dryland salinity is problematic in the Western Cape region of South Africa, with serious consequences for this water-scarce region. The research indicates a sensitivity to changes in land use, with rooting depth and the spatial distribution of vegetation being identified as main factors. The modeled vegetation strategy indicated an almost 50% reduction in catchment soil buildup. I request you to confer the degree on Richard Damien Hunter Bugan.
Liani Louw met promotor Professor P. van Rensburg.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the combination of its high alcohol content and complex volatile structure makes sensory evaluation of brandy very difficult. Rapid sensory profiling methods have not been validated for spirits beverages, and prior to the study, it was not clear whether applying these methods to brandy would be feasible. The outcome of the study extends the brandy sensory evaluation toolbox. I request on you to confer the degree on Liani Louw.
Custodia Lina Sofa Makamule with Supervisor Professor Corley Watoon.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, ladies and gentlemen, Ms. Custodia Makamule studied the effect of milk fermentation on the survival of Mycobacterium bovis, the bacterium that causes bovine tuberculosis or TB, in humans and many animal species. Her findings show that milk fermentation can effectively be used to inhibit these pathogens in contaminated milk. resulting in a safe beverage for human consumption. We're very excited about the findings of this study, as it may be used as a preventative measure in the spread of tuberculosis on the continent. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I present to you Custodia Makamuli and ask you to confer the degree on this candidate, and she's also the second of the Makamuli family to cross the stage this morning.
Melanie Nieuwoud with promoter Professor M. Rautenbach.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in the study of Melanie Nieuwoud, 3 barley malt biochemical markers were shown to assist in malt quality, beer predictions. This research will aid maltsters and brewsters to improve the screening and blending of barley malt to obtain high-quality end product in terms of beer foam and prolonged shelf life. I request you to confer the doctoral degree on Melanie Nieuwoud.
Khalid Sali with supervisor Professor Krishan Rana.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, multiple use of water bodies provide opportunities for sustainable fish farming in irrigation reservoirs in the western region of South Africa and elsewhere. This study investigated the impact of fish farming in irrigation reservoirs and its contribution to socio-economic development. It identified factors leading to eutrophication and proposed mitigation measures, contributing to improved integrated water management and socio-economic development. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree I presented to you to Khalid Saleh.
Meneer die Visie-Kanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte landbou aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confirm the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy, Agriculture. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. Nina Valeska-Bogus with supervisor Professor P. van Rensburg.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, brandy makers need an analytical framework and the appropriate tools to produce a brandy with desired style and characteristics. In this thesis, a framework has been laid down to improve the predictability of brandy styles. This will make South African brandy more competitive. I request on you to confer the degree on Nina Bogus.
Arno Erasmus met promotor Dr. P. Fourie.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, Penicillium digitatum green mold is the major cause of post-harvest decay in citrus fruit. To improve green mold control, the candidate studied the optimization of imazolol application, focusing on improving the commonly used dip application. Outcomes from the study has resulted in updated industry guidelines to improve fungicide application, disease control, and food safety. I request that you confer the degree on Arno Erasmus.
Rinus Knutse, Dr. P. Addison sal die verklaring namens die promotor doen.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in the study, the Globodera genus of nematodes in South Africa was characterized by means of surveys, phylogenetic studies, morphological descriptions, and biological investigations. We have gained insightful knowledge of the distribution, systematics, and biology of this group, enabling nematologists to make informed decisions regarding the management of these nematodes. I request you to confer the degree on Rinus Knutse.
Chusi Mutawila with Supervisor Dr. Lizelle Mostert.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the application of Trichoderma species as biocontrol fungi for the protection of grapevine pruning wounds was investigated in this study. The best time of application was determined. Additionally, the mechanisms of biocontrol included the production of a fungostatic secondary metabolite, as well as the activation of grapevine defense genes. I hereby request that you confer the degree on Chelsea Mutawila.
Willem Johannes Olivier met promotor Professor SVP Kloete.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, it is often alleged by sheep farmers that fine wool sheep are poorly adapted to some areas in South Africa. Now, these allegations have been refuted by Willem Olivier in his thesis that dealt with genetic parameters on various trait complexes. He also linked genetic information to economic information to assess the accuracy of selection at different levels of recording throughout industry. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I thereby ask you to confer the degree on Willem.
Saskia Gudrun van Diest with Supervisor Dr. Cheryl Lennox.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the South African apple industry has traditionally relied on fungicides to control apple scab, the most important apple disease worldwide. In this research, alternative management strategies were tested for the first time in South Africa, contributing to the sustainable, integrated management of this important disease. I request you to confer the degree on Saskia Gudrun van Diest.
Meneer die visiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte bosbou aan Koenraad Brand Wessels te verleen. Voor u die graad aan hom verleen, sal die promotor Professor Tim Rypstra 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen.
Meneer die visiekanselier, Petula denneplantasies is die grootste bron van strukturele hout in Suid-Afrika. In hierdie studie is die variasie in sekere strukturele houteienskappe ondersoek en empiriese modelle om sterkte-eienskappe van planke in staande bome te kan voorspel ontwikkel. Die resultate kan gebruik word om die negatiewe effekte van vinnige groei en laer rotasie ouderdomme van bome te bestuur. Ek versoek u om die graad aan Koenraad Brand Wessels te verleen.
Meneer die Fisiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan die kandidaate wat ek aan u voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of the dissertation. William Frederick Johannes Richard Hunter, met promotor Professor A. Engelbrecht.
Meneer die Fisiekanselier, counterproductive work behavior is a widespread and costly phenomenon. The cost of corruption in South Africa amounts to more than 100 billion rand each year. In this study, a valid integrity test has been proven in a culturally diverse sample. Selecting employees with higher integrity has the potential of developing a more productive workforce. Meneer die Fisiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad aan Richard Hunter te verleen.
Annelie Kreur met promotor Professor C. Boshoff.
Meneer die Fisiekanselier, handelsmerk verdowwing, in Engels brand allusion, was nog altyd 'n tamaletjie vir beide bemarkers en regsgeleerdes. Aangesien dit die onderneming se belangrikste bate, handelsmerk ekwiteit, nadelig beïnvloed. Dikwels eindig die dispute in duur regsgedinge. In haar studie formuleer die kandidaat duidelike riglyne gebaseer op haar empiriese bevindinge hoe handelsmerk verdowwing en die potensiële dispute wat daarop volg aangespreek kan word. Sodoende maak die kandidaat 'n beduidende bydrae tot die bemarkingsliteratuur met ewe belangrike implikasies vir toekomstige litigasie waar handelsmerk verdowwing ter sprake kan wees. Meneer die Fisiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad aan Annelie Kreur toe te ken.
Bright Mahembe with co-supervisor Professor DJ Malak.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the candidate identified some cognitive and non-cognitive characteristics that constitute learning potential and investigated the extent to which these characteristics combine to ensure a certain level of eventual learning performance. The results are useful interventions aimed at ensuring the success of the accelerated development of human resources from disadvantaged communities. I request you to confer the degree on Mr. Bright Mahembe.
Max Rudibert Steinbach met promotor Professor B.W. Smit.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in central banking circles, the state of the art with respect to quantitative macroeconomic modeling is presented by dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. Following the recent global financial crisis, these models have been extended to account for explicitly for financial sector imperfections. The candidate has put the research department of the South African Reserve Bank at the forefront by developing both a standard GST model of the South African economy and by extending it to provide for such financial sector imperfections. I request you to confer the degree on Mr. Rudy Steinbach.
Meneer die Fisiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad dokter in die wysbegeerte aan die kandidaate wat ek aan die voorstel te verleen. Die betrokke promotor sal telkens 'n kort verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer on the candidates whom I'll present to you the degree Doctor of Philosophy. The supervisor concerned will give a brief outline of a dissertation. Kenneth Guy Allen with Supervisor Professor Theo von Backstrom.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, packed rock beds are potentially suited to low-cost thermal energy storage in concentrating solar power plants. Mr. Allen investigated rock suitability and packed bed pressure drop and heat transfer characteristics. He formulated a method to determine optimum bed parameters, thereby providing a basis for techno-economic studies on rock bed storage. I request you to confer the degree on Kenneth Allen.
Matthew Dalben with Supervisor Professor Kim Jenkins.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the recycling of in-situ road building materials generates different blends of granular materials and reclaimed asphalt, or RA, which is the milled surfacing layer. This study provides insight into fundamental mechanical performance properties and durability considerations of recycled materials with varying compositions. In addition, the thermal capacity and conductivity of these materials, stabilized with foam bitumen in a road rehabilitation process, have been investigated and successfully modeled. In our milieu, seeking sustainable practices, this is highly relevant research. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, if this technology is effectively implemented, our pothole problems would cease to exist. I request that you confer the degree on Matteo Dalben.
Hendrik Adrianus Cornelis de Villiers met promotor Professor Thomas Niesler.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, this work considers e-tutoring systems for South African Sign Language. Hand tracking using the Earth mover's distance is proposed and shown to outperform existing methods. An automatic procedure of color calibration is successfully developed. The system generates natural language advice, not only describing the user's errors, but also suggesting appropriate corrections. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the degree on Hendrik de Villiers.
Louis Jacobus du Pre. Ek as promotor sal die verklaring oor die proefskrif doen. A novel in situ Fourier transform infrared method of analysis was developed and used to study the homogeneous liquid phase reaction kinetics of CO2 with MEA in alcoholic solvents. New, fundamentally derived rate expressions were developed for use in a numerical rate-based method to calculate the effective area in packed columns from absorption rate data. Meneer die fisiekanselier, ek versoek u om die graad aan Louis Jacobus de Pre te verleen. Johannes Hendrik Jacob Potgieter met promotor professor Martin Kamper.
Die fisiekanselier. In hierdie studie word 'n nuwe tipe glipsynkroon permanente magneet-windgenerator voorgestel as alternatief tot ander windgeneratorstelsels. Die eenvoud van die stelsel lê daarin dat geen radkas of omsetter gebruik word nie. Deur uitgebreide ontwerpoptimering en ondersoek na implementeringsaspekte asook praktiese toetse word die haalbaarheid van die voorstel bewys. Ek versoek u om die graad aan Johannes Potgieter te verleen.
Ali Miluk Rakbani, with supervisor Professor Christian Skreefer.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, the candidate invented the micro-CMM parallel kinematic manipulator. It is considered a viable positioning device for micrometrology. It offers the advantages associated with parallel manipulators while avoiding some of the traditional disadvantages such as the effects of angular errors, singularity problems, workspace limitation, and the extensive use of spherical joints. I request you to confer the degree on Ali Rukbani.
Wikus Theo Verlet met promotor Professor Martin Kamper.
Near the fisiekanselier, in this study, the viability of position sensorless controlled reluctant synchronous machine drives for industry applications is investigated. The industry applications are wind generators, electric vehicle drive motors, and electric mine engines. Several positive results from this study show that position sensorless controlled reluctant synchronous machines can indeed be considered for various industry applications. Versoek jy om die graad aan Wikus Verlet te verleen.
Michelle Zamidio met promotor ekself, die mede-promotor Dr. Karis Swarts sal die verklaring aflê.
Mr. Vice-Chancellor, in order to determine the viability and performance of a supercritical fractionation process, a process model was developed in Aspen Plus. In a novel approach, the model was used to prove that supercritical fractionation is a feasible process to consider for the removal of alkanes from a mixture of detergent range alcohol isomers. I request you confer the degree on Michelle Zamudio.
Meneer die visiekanselier, ek versoek u om aan die dokterskandidaate wie se name ook aan die voorgelê is, maar wat nie hier teenwoordig kan wees nie, die doktersgrade in hulle afwesigheid te verleen. Mr. Vice-Chancellor, I request you to confer the doctoral degrees on those candidates whose names have been presented to you, but who cannot attend to present the degrees in their absence.
Doctoral degrees on the candidates and their absence. Ladies and gentlemen, we have now conferred all the doctoral degrees at this graduation ceremony, and on behalf of Stellenbosch University, I wish to congratulate all of those who receive this great achievement. You exemplify the academic excellence that we strive for, and the basis of the way in which we're building a great continent. En dit was efterward familie vrienden, baie geluk en oprechte waardering vir die ondersteuning en opoffering deur die jare. All graduates, please stay in touch with the university. I invite graduates regularly to functions so that I can speak to them and ask them about their careers, and I hope to see you together in the review function soon, some way, near places where you are. Outside somewhere, you are invited to join our remuneration staff that sat in the foyer for a glass of coffee to celebrate this event. Ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, thank you for all the hard work that you have put in to make this all possible. And as we come now to the end of the proceedings, I hereby declare this meeting of the congregation of Stellenbosch University closed.